Now we're going to go ahead and implement an actual app that will handle our search feature, and then we'll also be using HTMX to actually perform the search itself. So let's go jump into our project and Python manage.py start app, and we'll call it search. Now in this case, it's just simply search. I am not necessarily going to put in models right now. I'm really just going to be focusing on the views. And so the main thing here is just defining a search view that takes in a request. And we want to grab the query, which if you remember back, it's request.get of queue. And then I'm also going to add in something else in here. But before I do anything further, I'll go ahead and say if request.htmx, then we're going to return render of some sort of response here, some sort of template with some sort of context. That context, in my case, will just start off as just the query. Okay. And then the other part is having a fallback. If it's not a HTMX request, we still want to render something out of that same context. Cool. So really, these two things aren't that much different. I have been using them over and over again, which is repeating myself. So really, I actually can just do something more like this, where we declare our default template. In this case, let's go ahead and do search and view.html. And then we want to have our other template in here. And this template will be search. Maybe we'll go ahead and do partials and results.html. So let's call this results as well. Cool. And so now we'll just go ahead and return back that template like that. Of course, in the request.htmx, if I needed to change the context, that's fine. But realistically, I just need to change the template. And this is true for our other app as well. All right, so let's go ahead and now put this view into our primary URLs, as well as into our settings as far as the app is concerned. So in here, we'll go ahead and add in search using single quotes. And then we'll go ahead and add in our URL here. So no longer do we need that search view. I'm going to get rid of the article search view altogether. And then just do from the search.views, I'm going to import search. Okay, so I don't even think I even used the article views anymore. None of them, in fact. So we can get rid of all of those imports there. I am going to leave the search view here though, and we'll come in and call this search, and then simply search view, and then we'll go ahead and give it a name of simply search. Okay, so search is going to be available anywhere. So in my template, I already have a block for that form. I don't want that anymore. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a folder for search, and in here, I'll go ahead and do my search form. So search form.html. And that's going to take place of what this is. So I'll go ahead and cut this out, paste it into my search form, and now use include. And it's going to be search and search-form.html. There we go. And our search form now is going to go to the URL of search. Okay. So no big surprise here, hopefully, with a lot of these things. So there's a couple of things I do need to implement in my search folder here. I need to add in the partials folder. And in there, I want to go ahead and do results.html. This, of course, would show me all of the results. So really, it's going to be for object in query set or object list, depending on how we name it in our context variables. I'll leave it in as that. And I'll give it a list element of simply just object.name. And we'll link that to a href. And it's going to be object.getAbsoluteURL. Hopefully nothing surprising about these things, right? It's something we've already done several times. And of course, now outside of partials, I'm going to go ahead and create the results. Let's call it results view, actually. So results view, and then just simply results. So of course, in the results view, we'll go ahead and extends base.html. And then we'll go ahead and do our block content. And block. And naturally, we'll go ahead and include our search, partials, and results.html. Okay, so far so good. And our results here, one other thing I want to do is add in a item for empty. So if the query set is empty, we'll go ahead and say no results found. Cool. So now in our base.html, we've got our HTML here. Our view, we just needed to change the actual template that was being used for the primary template. So that's results-view now. Search results view. Okay, so let's go into our homepage and let's do a quick search, and I'll just say hello world, hit enter, and I've got no results found. Cool. So naturally, there's no results found for several reasons. The biggest one being that there is no query set. So how are we going to go about doing this? Well, there's several different ways on how we can consider doing this, but I'm going to make it fairly simple on us first. Now, one of the things that I want to do is in this input, I'm going to go ahead and say value equals to request.get.queue, just like that. What that does is at least gives me the previous value that I actually searched, so it's actually in there. I think that's actually a good idea to have. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a select dropdown. So I'll go ahead and do select and type being equal to, well, the name actually being equal to type. And the options I want to have are simply the values of, let's say, article, and there's going to be article. This is really just the different model types I might end up using. So article and recipes. Right. So in the long run, maybe I don't even use articles, but in the short run, this at least gives me some sort of value that I can drop down and select. Notice that type actually comes up in here. And so what I want to do too is update which one of these is selected by default. So it sort of pre-fills that value. Now, there are several ways on how to get around this. And one of the things you might be wondering is, why am I hard coding this form when I have Django model forms? The reason I'm hard coding this form is just to make it nice and easy on me to do some of these conditions. So we totally could have it in other places, but when I hard code it in this case, I can still get that get call anywhere. And then I can also render these things out. So in other words, this template does not rely on a view at all, which is important because of how I'm actually using it right here. Okay. So again, the template does not rely on a view. Cool. So going back into that search form, let's go ahead and do a couple things. First off, I'll go ahead and say if request.get.type is equal to article, then we'll do something. Otherwise, we'll do something else. And what I'm doing here is I'm looking at the request method, right? And I'm looking for the type itself. So perhaps it's going to be articles or article. We can do either one. It doesn't really matter. But what does matter is when we actually use it. So if the type is article, then we'll just go ahead and say select it. Okay. And so I'm just going to copy this exact same thing for recipes. Okay. So recipe. And we might actually want these to be plural because it is searching. Cool. So now if I refresh in here, it actually will show me the correct URL and the ability to change what it is I'm searching in. Now, of course, I could also do something like all departments, which is not something I'm going to select just yet. Right? I will put it in here for an option, but I'm not actually going to set it up just yet, right? So we've got all recipes and articles. Okay, great. So now we need the actual view to handle this. But even before I put the view in, something we could do potentially is, well, what do we want to do here? Now, on this input type, I could call the action of search. I could use HTMX to actually call it. So I could use HTMX get here of search as well. Or, of course, I can actually come down here and use search, right? And the reason I want to do it on the input is so that I can have that type ahead feature, something we've already kind of seen, and that was that HX trigger. And that trigger actually went for key up, when it changed, and we delay however many seconds. I'm going to actually delay it to 200 milliseconds. And so the reason we want this on the input has to do with the fact that it's going to monitor the key up. So every time I'm typing, it's doing essentially a type ahead. But what's not actually being included here is this select item. So to include it, I can actually come in here and say hx-include, and then I can pass any sort of CSS selector here, right? To make things easy on me, I'm just going to go ahead and say ID equals to search-type. And I'll go ahead and use hashtag search type. So now when I actually push this with a get, it's going to also include this right here. So we can test this out in our results. We could say something like searched for request.get.queue under request.get and type. And we can even say, I think there's a title case. Let's try that out. I'll explain that in a moment. Okay, so let's refresh in here. Yeah, so search for hello under article. And maybe we do S, articles. That doesn't work for alls, which is why I don't want all. Also, we're not going to ever implement or not implement the method on how to handle all just yet. So, okay, search for hello world under articles. And now we search it for recipes. So if I search again, there we go. Okay, so now let's go ahead and make sure we save everything. And let's give it a shot. So our view should have the HTMX going through just like that. And it should be able to return that based off of that template. Okay, so let's go ahead and go back to our home page. And now I'm going to type in, let's say, hello world and recipes. Okay. Nothing seemed to happen. Well, of course it didn't happen, because one of the things that we didn't do in our search form is we actually don't have any element to push this to, right? We don't have a target. So to do the target, I'm going to go ahead and add another div class above this form. And right below the form, we're going to go ahead and say div ID equals to type ahead results. Okay, so now this search here, HX target, and yet again, we can use a CSS selector. In this case, I'm using the ID, and it should go in there. Okay, so we refresh now, and I'll go ahead and do hello world, and there we go. It actually is giving me those exact same results. Now, of course, if I hit submit, it still goes there. If I hit enter here, it should still also submit it, which we would see with the refreshes there and our logs. So this is pretty cool. So that's actually how the typeahead works. Now, of course, I need to actually set in results in the view, something I don't have yet, but this actually is now working pretty well, I think. So let's go ahead and implement the actual search. Now, before I do, there is something I need to do in my models for the recipe itself, and that is actually having a search feature. So you may recall back to when I created search for articles, I actually made this. So we can copy all that. I'm going to copy literally all of it. Now, typically I don't love just copying and pasting things willy-nilly, but this is something that is fairly fundamental to what we are doing. And the reason I made it in this method was so we could reuse it. So now we'll go ahead and put recipe manager, recipe query set, and we'll reuse that. And now I'm going to go ahead and say objects equals to that. Okay. And the only thing we should have to import is just Q. I did import literally everything, but I think Q would be the only one, as far as I know, for the import. So I'll bring that Q lookup right up here as well. Okay. So now I should have the search method on this query set. Now, the reason I did that is everything to do with the type. So search type equals to request.get of type. And now let's import the models we actually want to search. So from articles.models import article. from recipes.models import recipe. Okay. And so what I want to do is I want to map what the search type is to what the model would be. So search type mapping. And in this case, we're going to do recipe is equal to recipe. Recipes is equal to recipe. And then the same thing for articles, right? And I should probably reverse these. Okay. Let's put these up here. Just like that. Okay. So this search type mapping, now what I want to do is give a default class. I'll call it class with a capital K. The default class I'll use is recipe. Now I'll say if search underscore type in this search type mapping dot keys, then I'll just go ahead and set the class, that capital K class, equal to that search type from the search type mapping. Okay, simple enough. So now we've got this class in here. So it's either going to be the article class or the recipe class. And what do we know about these things? Well, I can do query set of that class, again, replacing the actual variable that I used here with the actual model itself, dot objects dot search query equals to that query. And now in my context, I can bring in the query set being equal to that QS. I definitely do not need query as a context variable any longer because that query is coming right from here. So we've already seen it in our templates. We've used it a few times now, right here, right here. So we definitely don't need that as context. The template can infer it itself. So we save this, and now we have a fairly robust search. Now, assuming that we have the actual model manager set up correctly on every given model for performing a search. In this case, I do not have it set up correctly. This should be, instead of title, it should be name. Content, it should be most likely description, right? And I can add more lookups to this still, like let's go ahead and put this in parentheses here and parentheses here. And we can separate these out by lines so they're a little bit easier and more user-friendly to read. Definitely make sure it has a pipe except for the very last lookup. Okay. So now we have at least a little bit better of a lookup that's more specific to recipe. One of the things that we should notice is in my search results, I used object.name. Now, of course, the actual articles don't have a field called name. Now, you may or may not remember this. It's okay if you don't. But they do have the get absolute URL method. So since they don't have one name, they have one for title. I can actually come in here and just say property and do define name, and that's going to return self.title. Now, I think I actually use these things interchangeably too often. It would probably be better that I use one or the other all the time, but sometimes that's not practical. But since I actually changed this on article, what I'm going to do in my recipe is the exact same thing, but for title. So just reversing it just to ensure that if I accidentally didn't change any of these lookups, it would still work. Now, that also might be true for description and content, but I just think title is like kind of the key one here because these are the two that I'm actually going to use in my search results. Okay, so now let's actually see if it all works. Assuming the server is still running, it is. Let's go ahead and take a look. I'm going to actually go to my home page. This time I'm going to go ahead and search a taco, and I want to search in recipes. Now notice that it actually did not trigger that again, right? So it's definitely not triggering it one more time. So how do we solve that? Well, going back into our search form, it shouldn't be that surprising that it's actually using these same triggers right here. But this time, instead of including the search type, what we want to do is include the search query. Okay, so we save that. Everything else is the same. Let's refresh on our home page with nothing in there. And I'll go ahead and say taco. no tacos under articles, hit recipes. Recipes didn't do anything. So of course it doesn't necessarily work perfectly in the type ahead in this case. So I'll go ahead and submit it again. And of course I now have those things showing up, and it does change the location as to where things are. The submit button is still there, which I think is nice. But of course, there's a number of things that I might consider changing, such as remembering which type that I end up using any given time. So if I search taco again this time, now I've got here. So this actually makes sense to where we might reverse the order of the dropdown and just altogether get rid of this, right? So again, it's not necessarily a perfect method, and there definitely is a way to make this all work with HTMX, but it's just something I'm just not going to get into right now. But really, we refresh in here, go into recipes, search a recipe. There's all of our recipes. It's in the type ahead, so we didn't change our URL at all. It's literally right here, so I can click on one, and what do you know? Pretty cool. So this also might ring a bell of like, hey, maybe I actually don't want to have the entire query set coming back in my HTMX request. Maybe I only want a few items in there. So in that case, we would actually come in and say context of that query set equals to the QS, and then we can slice it up to, let's say, 5 results. And so that means that it will only give me 5 results back instead of everything, which I think is also really cool, because then if we only have 5 results, we can also change the context that's coming through for our rendered template here to say, hey, view all. In other words, let's go ahead and say context, say, HTMX. Wait a minute, I'm putting context as HTMX, but request.html. What about request.get? I used all that stuff. Now, the next question would be, if you're following my line of thinking here, in results, can we see if request.htmx, and if so, can we actually use these for that search? So now I'll go ahead and say a href equals to, search, and then the q equaling to this, and then the type equaling to this, and view all. Okay. So we refresh in here. Let's go ahead and go to our homepage. We'll go recipes, taco. Hey, what do you know? It says view all. I click on it. Hey, it takes me over to that search, and it has those other items. Pretty cool. Now, if I do that search again, I'm already on that search page, so it's not necessarily showing me that. But I think it's like, this is HTMX. This is what's really, really cool. Now, one of the things that I haven't talked about a whole lot, I don't think, is these pipes and this right here. That's called a template filter. So there's a bunch of them inside of Django where you can maybe uppercase something, right? Or you could lowercase something, which in this case, it is already lowercase. And there's many, many other things that you could add to this. So feel free to look at the Django template tag filters using a pipe like that. But this one right here is very similar to Python's. If you use like my string in Python and did .title, that's actually what happens here. And what's cool too is you can actually make those custom ones yourself. It's not something we need just yet, but that is actually a fairly robust search feature, I would argue. Now, there are still a lot of downsides to it, and that is how we do this search type mapping thing. What would be better is just to have one query and have it search everything. That is computationally possible, but it's a lot more challenging to implement. This, I think, is just like really simple to implement, but now we have a way to let the users decide what they're searching. The other part about this is, what are users searching most? Right. So one of the things you might consider is actually making a model for search to monitor both the query and the search type. Like they're intentionally looking at articles more, or they're intentionally looking at recipes more. So what you would end up doing is maybe changing the default values for this, or you would actually decide to spend more times creating articles or articles that help them with recipes. I mean, it could just tell you a lot about what people are looking for to improve your overall search altogether. So yeah, it might be a good idea to save that.